Thank you for coming to the cemetery walk. This is my very first year participating in the cemetery walk, so bear with me. Perry A. Birkett and several of his family members are laid to rest right here. The center tree grave marker represents a story told of a life cut short. The ivy meaning friendship and memory. Perry A. Birkett was my great-great-great-uncle. Perry was born in August of 1861 or 1862 in Washington, Illinois, on the family farm to Mary Jane and William Birkett. He was raised on the family dairy farm on the southeast corner of Washington. Now, Perry literally grew up in the dairy business and became an expert dairyman himself. In 1890, he took full charge of the dairy business and became an expert dairyman. He took full charge as owner of Birkett Dairy, which his father started before him, and developed a dairy business larger than anyone else before him. He was quoted as saying, "Good butter, cream, and milk bring in good dollars." Perry was one of the first members of the Washington Commercial Club and a member of the Methodist Church. In 1883, Perry married Emma Viola Thomas, joining two of Washington's pioneer families. Emma was born in Tippecanoe, Ohio, to David S. and Olive Thomas, both of which are buried right here with Emma and Perry. Emma moved to Washington with her parents when she was 15 years old. Perry and Emma have 5 children. 2 children died very young and are buried here with their parents. That is Frances, who died at age 3, and Guy, who died at age 6. They had 3 children live to adulthood: Laverne, Olive for Emma's mother, and Dean. Emma also had a sister buried here. Her name was Alice, and she died at the age of 18. I am assuming that the tree is in honor of Alice as well as their 2 children for a short but much loved life. I am here also to tell you about the rest of the Birkett family and how they came to Washington. It all started with William Birkett and Mary Jane Keyes, Perry's parents. William was born to Thomas and Mary Field Birkett in Addison County, Vermont. His parents are originally from England. As an adult, William came to Fort Clark, which is now Peoria, in September of 1831. Around 4 years later, he came to Washington Township and laid claim to 160 acres of land in the southeast corner of Washington. He built a cabin and lived there until his death in 1890, which is when Perry took over the farm. On May 12, 1842, William and Mary Jane were married. She was one of 8 children born to Laban and Johanna Keyes. Mary Jane was born in Erie, Pennsylvania, however, moved to her parents to Michigan when she was a young child. They only lived in Michigan for a few years, and then they moved to Fort Clark, which is Peoria, and then 2 years after that, they moved and settled in Washington. While William made a name for himself in the dairy business, manufacturing 200 pounds of butter weekly, Mary Jane raised the family. William and Mary had 12 children. They had 1 daughter, Mary, that died in infancy. David died in the Civil War as a result of wounds sustained in the Battle of Bentonville. Clara Jane married Henry Clay Scott, and they had 5 children, at least 5 children. Anna Liza, also known as Annie, married Jacob Finch. Charles Laban was my great-great-grandfather. He also tried to join the Army to serve in the Civil War, but he was too young and the government would not accept him. In 1870, he married Clarissa Van Camp, also known as Clara. She was a native of Ohio. Clarissa's parents came to Washington in a covered wagon, and they lived the hardships of pioneer life. Charles was also a successful farmer and was the first resident of Washington to pay $100 an acre for farmland in this vicinity in the year 1879. The farm was 1 mile south of Washington, where Weenus Trucking is now located. He lived there on the farm till about the year 1905, when he moved to town to 500 South Main Street, and that house still stands there today. Charles was the township supervisor beginning in 1896 and was reelected 6 consecutive terms. He had 2 sons follow in his footsteps. Now, while Charles was working, Clarissa was raising the family. They had 6 children, 2 died in infancy, 4 reaching adulthood. David, Frank, Shelby, and Pearl Dewdrop, my great-grandmother. Another son was Lafayette, and he married Helen Jane Newberry. He was an outstanding citizen of Washington. He loved his community, his church, and his family. They had 4 children together. George A. never had children. However, his obituary read that he was a great lover of children, and he spent the last years of his life living with his brother Perry, who is buried right here. Another son was William Birkett, that had married Ellen Wapp. They had 2 children, or 2 daughters and 1 son, and they farmed here in Washington. Ella Birkett married William Cooper of Cooper Station, and they had 5 children. Hattie Birkett married Joseph Morris. Joseph worked on the railroad until he married Hattie, and after that he farmed and helped found the Tazewell County Farm Bureau. He was an advocate for farmers everywhere. Lester Patty first was married to Estina Van Meter. They had 6 children together. Tina died at a very young age after a short illness, which we believe was pneumonia. And after that, he married Mrs. Lydia Belsley, who had also been widowed. And after Lester died the following year after they were married, and Lydia the year after that. And then, of course, the 12th child was Perry A. Birkett, who is buried right here, and I've already told you all about him. So we hope that you enjoy the rest of your tour. Thank you for coming. If you have any questions, just ask, and we have several pictures over here for you to look at.
Welcome. Is that on? Welcome. My name is Lenora Welker, but I prefer to be called Nora. My husband Joseph and I lived in Washington over 100 years ago. Joseph was born on a farm in Etna Township in Whitley County, Indiana. He was the son of Joseph and Lucinda Welker. Joseph, his father, was one of 16 children, and his grandfather was of German descent. Both of my in-laws were born in Pickaway County, Ohio. My mother-in-law was not born there. She was born in Pennsylvania, but moved when she was about 4 years old, so they were raised in Pickaway County, Ohio. Shortly after they were married, they moved to Indiana. They would have 7 children, a boy Levi, who was a lawyer, another son named Isaac, who worked as a carpenter and later became a United Brethren minister, 4 daughters, Matilda, Susanna, Julia, and Caroline, and of course my husband Joseph, who was a surgeon and physician. When Joseph and Lucinda, shortly after they were married, as I said, they moved to Indiana. They left for Indiana with $25 in their wallet and a deed for 80 acres of land. They cut a path 3 miles long to what would become their family plot, their family farm, and there they built a log cabin. For the next several years, they suffered and struggled with the life of a pioneer, the uncertainty that came with pioneer life. At that time, the closest marketplace was in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and Joseph and Lucinda would haul their crop all the way to Fort Wayne, and there they would collect 25 cents a bushel for their wheat. My father-in-law was a prominent man in Etna County. He served for 9 years as the constable and for 7 years in the office of the Justice of the Peace. My mother-in-law and father-in-law became very religious in the year of 1844. At that time, they joined the United Brethren Church, and for over 50 years they would become faithful members of the church. My mother-in-law was a very kind, loving woman. It was told to me by her daughter Susanna that on her deathbed, she said, looked up into her daughter's eyes and said, "I'm so blessed to know where I will be going." And with that, she passed away very peacefully. My husband Joseph attended the Chicago Homeopathic College and became a physician. We married in 1881, and a year later, we had our first child. His name was Emmett DaCosta. Joseph practiced medicine in Iowa in 1884 and 1885. He then decided to return to Chicago to further his education. He went back to the same college, the Chicago Homeopathic College and graduated in 1887. At that time, he was offered a job in Washington, Illinois. We arrived in Washington in the fall of 1887. We loved life in Washington. Both of us loved to be outside, and my husband Joseph loved to ride his bicycle. There was one article in the Washington News that stated, "It's no trouble for Dr. Welker to ride his bike. He gracefully sits in the saddle, puts his little feet on the paddles, and you should see him skedaddle." He loved to ride around town and did it whenever he possibly could. Life was good in Washington. We loved living in Washington. In 1890, the unthinkable happened. Our only child, now just over 8 years old, became ill with diphtheria, and on April 25th, 1990, he passed away. We chose this plot to be the place that we would lay our son to rest. The headstone that we chose is a tree cut short, which symbolizes the life of our child, which was cut short at only 8 years, 3 months, and 22 days of age. I chose ivy, as ivy signifies memory. I would never forget my child, and I wanted those who were around to remember him also. We stayed in Washington for an additional 9 years, at which time we moved to Mattoon, Illinois. For the next 15 years, Joseph practiced in Mattoon. The last year of Joseph's life, he became very ill, and many times we thought he was not going to make it, but he would rally, and for a short time he would become healthy again. In the fall of 1911, we determined that he actually had a valvular heart condition, and we decided that we would seek treatment in Chicago. We drove to Chicago, which was very difficult on him. And before he could enter the treatment, he needed to rest for a few days. His sister Matilda had a daughter that lived in Chicago, so we went to stay with her daughter. And we waited for him to get better. I was sure he would rally, I was sure he would become better, and he would be able to have treatment and everything would be fine. But he didn't get better. And unfortunately, he died at the home of our niece. He was 59 years of age. At that time, his body was returned to Washington to be laid to rest next to our precious son, Emmett. I stayed in Mattoon for several years. I never married. And finally, I moved to Crown Point, Indiana. In 1935, at the age of 89 years old, I also passed away and was returned to Washington to be with my beloved son and husband. And that is the story of our family. Thank you.
John McClintock is a gentleman who is not known for his extensive family in Washington, like the Denharts, the Birketts, a lot of other folks that you'll hear about today. But as they say on the front of our ticket, everyone who has lived here, died here, or just stopped for a moment is a part of the history of Washington. One of the things, of course, we thought was significant was the stone, which I'm sure you've probably heard about 2 times already. So I won't bore you with the details of how the stone looks. The broken limb obviously is significant. The calla lily, I don't know if it was on another one, it signifies marriage. And the ivy signifies memory. So that's the significance of this type of stone. Interestingly enough, John McClintock's name on the stone is John P. His name is actually John T., John Thomas. And the name McClintock here was spelled with MCL. In the history that I read, it's MCC. And in the brochure, it's MCK. So I'm not sure anyone really knows what or how his name was spelled. John's great-grandparents came from Ireland in the 1700s. His grandparents moved to the bluegrass section of Kentucky, which interestingly enough was about the time some young man was becoming famous by the name of Daniel Boone. There are some family documents from the McClintock family that does show Daniel Boone's signature on some of the documents. John T.'s family moved to Ohio. John was the 5th child and 4th son of 12 children. He grew up in Ohio, and in 1846, when he was 27, he moved to Indiana, where he was a teacher. He was a teacher in Indiana for 20 years. In 1849, he married a lady named Jane Sharp. Unfortunately, they were married only 7 short months, and she passed away. In 1950, the day after Christmas, as a matter of fact, he married a young lady named Angeline Eccles. She was the daughter of Colonel Samuel and Jane Eccles. Now, the Eccles family was originally from Virginia, but they moved to Kentucky. Colonel Eccles was considered an outstanding military man, full of patriotism and an expert in drilling soldiers. They moved to Indiana in 1835, where the paths of John T. and Angeline crossed. Colonel Eccles served as a state representative of Indiana and Johnson County Commissioner. His brother also was a state representative, and at the time of the marriage of John and Angeline, Colonel Eccles was the wealthiest landowner in the area with assets of $7,800. Angeline had also 2 brothers of note, Joseph and Gerard. In 1843, they went to Iowa to break prairie land. Gerard was a carpenter by trade. After only 3 years, they went back home to Indiana. In 1854, Gerard came to Washington, where he worked as a carpenter and also clerked in a store. While here, he wrote to John and Angeline, telling about this great little town in central Illinois. Within months, they had transferred and settled here in Washington. They lived in the southeast corner of Washington Township. We don't have a record of the exact location, but we're thinking, out toward Pleasant View School, somewhere in that district. Gerard lived here 4 years and then moved back home to Indiana to take care of the family homestead. His mother had passed away and his father was aging, and he took over the homestead. The McClintocks stayed for 14 years here in Washington. John apparently taught school as he did in Indiana, although there are no Washington records of it. He was also very active in his church, which is the Presbyterian Church. He worked as an elder and also served as a deacon. He was considered one of the chief pillars of the community and of very strong faith. He was also a school treasurer for 9 years. He was also considered a very strong Democrat with, quote, a warm admiration of President Cleveland. They had 2 children, Sarah Jenny and Mary Gertrude. Now, both of these little girls, unfortunately, died at a very young age, again signifying the broken branch. Sarah Jenny was 9.5 when she passed away. She was considered very bright and had a talent for composition. Mary Gertrude, they don't have much information about, and was only 16 months old when she passed away. So they lost both their daughters. They said that Mary Jenny was a very bright young lady, as I said, and she kept a small diary. And her parents, they said, kept that with religious care. She noted many thoughts and fancies in her little diary. In 1868, after 14 years in Washington, they moved to Livingston County, just north of Chenoa. No information why they left Washington, but that's indeed where they settled. Mr. McClintock was considered a natural farmer and horticulturist, which took pride in beautifying his surroundings. He had very poor health by then and had rented out his farmland in Chenoa. So he took most of his time gardening, reading, and improving his grounds. He was said to have 40 different kinds of trees in his yard and garden. They said he was never rich in material health, but he felt he was very rich in contentment of mind and very well respected. In 1891, he was stricken with paralysis. They sold their farm and used the money to purchase a home in Washington because he wanted to come back to Washington, where he was from, or where he spent many happy years. Unfortunately, while they were in the process of moving into their home, he had a second stroke, which caused his death in 1892. He died in Chenoa, but had requested to be buried in Washington with his daughters. Angeline returned to her family in Indiana, and that's all that we know of her. John left a lot of his estate to the McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago. Other McClintock relatives came to the area, Tazewell County, Peoria County, Livingston, and Woodford counties. He had a brother, Daniel, who settled in Kruger Township, and Daniel had a son born in El Paso. They had one other relative of significance. His name is unknown, but he was an engineer for the TP&W Railroad. He was actually engineering in 1887 at the time of the Great Chatsworth Rail tragedy. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. There was an excursion train that used to take people to Niagara Falls to visit. As this train was loaded in Peoria, they loaded approximately, several hundred people in Peoria, and at 11:45 at night, it was on its way to Niagara Falls. There were 2 engines, a baggage car, there was a superintendent's car, coaches, chair cars, and sleepers. They passed through Washington just past midnight. Most people either sleeping or chatting about their trip ahead and all the sights they were going to see. No one was aware of a small fire at a trestle just east of Chatsworth. The train was traveling 35 to 40 miles per hour, and the fire had weakened the trestle so it couldn't support the weight. But the engineers spotted the fire only after it was too late to stop. They obviously had no other way to communicate that this fire was happening. Telescoping took effect. In other words, when the train hit the trestle, it crashed into the culvert, and the cars, being all made of wood, started splintering into each other and just kept going and going into each other. Approximately 75 to 80 people were killed, and more than 300 were injured. And of course, after the train cars telescoped, they burned because they were all of wood. The McClintock individual, who was the engineer, was found in the wreck with his hand still clutching the throttle with the engine in the reverse mode. That's all we know about him. That's the McClintock family and all we know at this point.
Good afternoon. My name is Clifford Mason Anthony, and you all are right here at the Anthony family plot, right here in the Washington Cemetery. This is my ma, Elizabeth Bulkley Anthony, and Ma and I are going to tell you about what we consider one of the most famous bankers, not only in Washington, but probably in the entire Midwest in the 1800s. And that's my older brother, Charles E. Anthony. Now, the reason I think Charles is so famous is because eventually Charles and Henry Denhart went on and built this bank that you recognize up on the Washington Square that we now call the Denhart Bank. But my brother Charles actually was one of the primary builders of that bank. Now, Charles was born here in 1846. His ma and pa, Elizabeth and S.N. Anthony, came out here as true pioneers, probably by wagon, from Massachusetts. And they settled in Washington. My pa was the first tinsmith in Washington. Before that, they didn't have anything made out of tin unless it came up the river from St. Louis. But my ma and pa took care of us, but unfortunately, my pa passed on when Charles was only 11 years old. But Ma looked after us, and after we got through primary school, Ma wanted us to have a higher education. There was no high school in Washington, actually, till 1876. That was over 15 years later, so Ma had to send us out east, where she came from, to get more schooling. But my brother and his eventual business partner, Henry Denhart, they learned most of their business from local Washington people. Mr. Denhart learned from somebody named Dr. R.B.M. Wilson. Now, Dr. Wilson, he had lots and lots of irons in the fire. He was a medical doctor for a while, and then he was a businessman, and then he became a politician. He was a state senator. He was the campaign manager for somebody you folks probably have heard of called Stephen Douglas of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. But he taught Henry Denhart, but my brother, he learned from somebody named Richard Smith. Now, Dick Smith owned a dry goods store up on Washington Square. And if you look in this old picture from the 1860s, you'll see in the middle there, if you look close, it says R.D. Smith. Now, if you look at the windows and you look at the top of the buildings, I think you can see what's up there now. On the left, I think you can see black, and brown. Here, I think you can go in there and buy Green Rivers and chocolate phosphates. That's my favorite, and candy. And that's Holland's Mercantile. That's a very famous store back in those days because that's where Abraham Lincoln came to town every 3 months when he rode through and riding the circuit. That's where they met. Abraham Lincoln met a lot of politicians up there. He met people that went on to be governor of Illinois. He met people up there that went on to be Civil War generals. Why, Abe Lincoln came through town the last time in the fall of 1859. That was just a few months before he was nominated as the first Republican nominee for the President of the United States. So that's a very famous store, and I wouldn't be surprised that my brother Charles even met old Abe up there, because my brother worked up there as a clerk, and Mr. Smith sold him half interest in the store after a couple of years. Well, in 1865, Mr. Smith was interested in moving on, a little more political, and so his friend Abraham Lincoln appointed Dick Smith as Washington's postmaster. And Mr. Smith asked my brother, "Do you know anybody who wants to buy the other half of my store?" Well, my brother trotted right down to Henry Denhart, his buddy that he'd known since they were boys, and he and Henry Denhart bought Dick Smith's store. And they opened Anthony and Denhart Dry Goods Store. Well, they had a big black safe up there, and by the way, I think that safe's still sitting there, just got a little different paint job. But they had a big black safe there in the back of their store, and people would come in and say, "Can I keep my valuables in your safe?" Because there was really only one other bank in the area. And they said, "Sure." And within a year, they opened Anthony and Denhart Banking Company right there in the back of their dry goods store. Well, they ran that bank for 6 years right in the back of their store, and then they went on and they bought this vacant lot, and they built their bank building in about 1874. Well, those two men were probably some of the busiest bankers in the Midwest. By the height of their business, when they finally separated in 1885, they were financing property in 12 surrounding counties outside of Tazewell and in 12 other states in the Midwest. They became so wealthy that they had to have some place to invest their money, and so they looked out in the Wild West. There are a couple of Wild West towns out there that no one had ever heard of that they traveled out to. One of them now is called Denver. You might have heard of that. And another one's called Cheyenne. And there's a river that runs right along between Denver and Cheyenne. It's called the Platte River. And they were the two managing partners in the largest cattle breeding associations in the United States. At one point, they owned 125,000 head of Hereford they pastured out there. And so they did a lot of traveling out there to check on their cattle. But things got pretty busy. They were running not only a dry goods store, a bank. They bought a lumber yard in town. They were running their cattle business. My brother was named as the director of real estate loans for the Connecticut Mutual Life Insurance Company. They just didn't have enough room up there in that little bank. And so in 1885, my brother and I moved to Peoria. The Washington News at that time said, "Charles Anthony has too many irons in the fire for the peace of mind required by the average human being." He and Henry Denhart were friends when they separated. They just were both so busy they had to go their own separate ways. But I've told you probably enough about Charles and how much of a businessman he was. Now I want my Ma to tell you about his family and his congenial personality. Okay, Ma? Okay. 1, 2, 3. Okay, Ma. Okay. Ma, I'll hold this for you.
Oh, thank you. It's so nice to see so many of you here today interested in Washington history, and we're really happy to be a part of that history. I'm very proud of both my boys and all my family, but since Charles isn't here to talk about himself and we're talking about Charles, I especially want to tell you a little bit about his family life. Charles was such a good boy, and when he was in grade school, he had a lot of friends that he liked to play with. However, at a very early age, he wasn't afraid to show that he liked hard work as well. And he worked, as Clifford told you, at the Richard Smith dry goods store up on the square. Why, he probably did meet Abraham Lincoln there. I raised the boys alone, as Clifford also told you, after my dear husband passed away. Charles was 11 and Clifford was just 5 at the time. But I made sure that they got a good education. However, I wasn't quite satisfied with the grade school education they got here in Washington, so I did send them out to the military academy out east. They also worked very hard, probably to pick up the slack with their father not being around, and they learned a lot from just the Washington businessmen around. When Charles married his first wife, Eloise, he built the Lewis Holland's house here in town. Eloise died in 1867 at age 19 after they were married just a short time. It was a very sad and difficult time. But fortunately, Charles was able to find happiness again when he married Miss Hattie Kimball, an accomplished and very charming Washington lady. Their marriage was happy and congenial, and they had a very good family life. But they built the mansion on South Main Street that some of you may know as the Stimpson House. They furnished it quite handsomely and lived there until 1885 when they moved to Peoria. He eventually sold that home to Mr. A.G. Danforth, another banker, when he purchased it for his daughter Mary, who was being married to George Stimpson. Most of you, well, as I said, most of you probably know that as the Stimpson House because the Stimpsons lived in that home from 1898 till 1984 when their daughter Susan died there. Charles and his business partner, Henry, over there, were very busy, but when he could, he took trips with his family and tried to spend as much time with them as possible. Probably the worst time for his family when he was traveling to check on his investments, of which there were very, very many. It wasn't very easy to travel in those days. However, when the train came to town, he could get to California in just a week. He caught it at the end of Holland Street up here, the Chicago and Alton train, and traveled to many places out west, Denver, L.A., Cheyenne, and traveled all over. Sometimes he even took the family with him. One summer, when it was especially hot, kind of like this summer, they went to Colorado, and while Charles was checking on his cattle business, the family enjoyed the cool Colorado weather. After Charles became very well established in business, he took the whole summers off and they vacationed. They often went to Mackinac Island in Michigan, and he even took you sometimes, didn't he, Clifford? That's right. Charles also raised thoroughbred horses, and one summer he even took the horses to Michigan. People in Washington were pretty amazed at all the traveling our family did, because most of them had never even been to Peoria. And even the editor of the paper seemed pretty interested in our travels because he wrote about all of them in the paper. However, not all of Charles and Hattie's travels were happy ones. I can remember one distressing evening when he came to my house very upset and said that he and Hattie were taking the early train to Florida. They weren't telling the people in Washington that why they were going. They said it was for Hattie's health, but in truth it was because their one-year-old baby, Clyde, was deathly ill with pneumonia, and they were really hoping the Florida sun would cure his illness. However, he only worsened, and Hattie and Charles were grief-stricken when their son died. We all would be as parents, right? But they went on. We all had to go on in those days. We didn't have medicine to take care of us, so you'd either let a little blood, put on a chest poultice, and get lots of fresh air and sunshine. Almost everybody lost a child in those days. Well, I lost Charles' younger brother, little Forrest Noble, when he was only 1 year old. But then I went on and had another fine son, Clifford, here.
Okay, Ma, that's enough. Sit down, please.
Wait a minute. I'm not done. I want to tell about your older sister,
Okay,
Florence.
this is your last story, Ma.
My daughter Florence was special too. She always took good care of me, and I can remember one summer she took me out east to Massachusetts where my home was. Oh my, the memories from that trip. I'll never forget them. Florence worked with for Charles and Henry Denhart in the bank for almost 10 years before she married. And then in my declining years, I went to live with her and her husband in Ohio. But I made her promise to bring me back here when I died. And that's what she did. So you'll see me to my stone over there next to my dear husband, Charles.
Thanks, Ma. You want to sit down?
Yep.
Careful. Well, after Charles and I moved to Peoria, we opened banks over there. They were called the Anthony and loan and trust company. Remember that dry goods store I told you about, the big black safe? Well, we got to Peoria, we bought a big black safe, and we opened a business called the Peoria Safe Deposit Company. People brought their things in, and we kept their valuables over there in Peoria, too. Charles only worked several more years, and his health wasn't good, so he retired on to Los Angeles, one of his homes. And that's where he actually passed away. And so he's not buried here in this plot, and that's why he's not allowed to talk to you all today. I worked 25 more years in Peoria as a banker, and I might say pretty prominent banker too at that. Then I retired, but every year before I retired, I came back to Washington for what we call the homecoming. You folks probably don't remember that, but every fall there was a homecoming. You see how they decorated the bank with flags all over it? They did that every year at homecoming. They invited all the former residents to come back, and many of them did. But when I passed on in 1919, my family knew where I wanted to be buried, right down here in the Anthony family plot. So after my funeral, the procession just proceeded right across the river and buried me right here with my dear wife Flora and my 2 children. And that's where I am today. However, you know what? A large part of me lies out in Los Angeles with my brother, my big brother, Charles. Thank you.
This is Henry Denhart, and this is my wife, Clara. I was born in Germany on December 8th in 1842. And I moved to Washington with my parents, and my parents moved to Washington in 1853. We were Andrew and Maria, and I was one of 11 children. I was educated in the local schools, and the Dr. R.B. Wilson was one of my teachers, and he had a great personal influence on me. It was Dr. Wilson that I credit with teaching me the habits of thrift and righteousness. I worked hard as a young boy, as you would expect of a good German Lutheran. Dr. Wilson was married to Charles Anthony's sister. Now, I mentioned Charles Anthony because we were good boyhood friends, and also we went into our first business venture together, a dry goods business up on the square in Washington. Now, I think you've been to the Anthony plot, and so you've heard quite a bit about the relationship between Charles and myself, so I won't go into a lot more of that at this time, but we were quite active together, and we got into the cattle business in Colorado. We got into quite a bit of property throughout the state, or in other states also, and I became quite successful. One of the other ventures that we had was the lumber yard. That lumber yard was on the corner of Burton and Main Street. Now, at that time, I owned the entire property from Main to Market and Burton to Holland. That whole piece of property was mine, and we worked hard at it. We even opened a bank. There's a picture of that bank right here. It became the Henry Denhart. It was the Henry Denhart and Company Bank. It's on the northwest corner of the square in Washington. Mr. Anthony moved to Peoria in 1885, but I continued to operate the lumber yard on the corner there until 1903. As I said, I was a hard-working German Lutheran, and I didn't have much time for anything other than making money. Until a young woman came to town, Clara Lawson. She moved to Washington with her widowed mother in the early 70s. That's 1870s. We were married in March of 1872. We lived in the carriage house while our house was being built. That's this house right here. It's on Main Street. 212 South Main is the address. And it was built by James Smith and Sons. James Smith was 47 years old and from Scotland. The Smiths were well known for their abilities as carpenters. They did really an excellent job, and they also had built all of the railroad depots in Illinois over to the Indiana border. This home was considered to be one of the finest at its time when it was built. I've heard reported that I was a very successful businessman and considered to be the wealthiest man in central Illinois. Being a good German Lutheran, I'm not going to brag about myself, so I'm going to let Clara tell you more about me and a little bit about herself also.
Well, my name is Clara Lawson Denhart, and I was born in Pennsylvania in 1853. My father was Reverend Samuel Lawson, and he died when I was a young teenage girl. And so my mother and I came here to Washington. She had two sisters here, and one of them was Mrs. Josiah Snyder. Several of my siblings stayed on the East Coast. I was the youngest of 10 children. When we came here, I met Henry. Henry was in his 30s, and we were married in March of 1872. I was just 19 years old, and at the time, we had planned a good-sized wedding because Henry was a successful businessman. However, my mother, who had not been well since my father's death, became more ill, and she died. I had had a green silk dress made for our wedding and a wonderful trousseau put together, but with my mother's death, our wedding was very quiet and small, and I didn't wear the green silk dress because it was a little too showy and elaborate following a sadness like her death. And we packed the trousseau and the green silk dress in a trunk, and we were going east to meet some of my family. That was for our wedding trip. And unfortunately, there was a train wreck, and the car that had my trunk and the trousseau and green silk dress burned. And so I never got to wear that green silk dress. We did settle in this wonderful house on Main Street, and the dining room was quite large. The table could seat upwards of 20 people, and we did entertain. There was a button, there still is a button on the floor in the dining room that would call the maid to come and clear the table or bring the next course. And one of the nephews tells the story about visiting when he was a 10-year-old boy, and his uncle Henry was pushing for the button. Henry was a short man. He's just about my height, as you can see. And he had trouble reaching for that button. And he said, "Where's that damn button?" Well, our nephew was scandalized. We did have some trouble. I was a member of St. John's Lutheran Church, and we had some trouble in the church. And several of us, including my uncle Josiah Snyder and his wife, decided that we needed to form our own church. And so 19 of us decided that we would form St. Mark's Lutheran Church. I believe it's still on South Main Street. Anyway, we didn't have enough money to build a church right away, so we held our services elsewhere. But since the lumber yard was no longer in existence, in about 1910, Henry decided that he would donate that property to St. Mark's so that a church could be built. Now, Henry talks about being a good Lutheran, but he was not a Lutheran member of the church at the time. So we did build the church, and Henry not only donated the land, but he donated $20,000 so the stone building could be built. Walter Benson was the person hired from Peoria to do the stonework on the church. And there are stories that it cost $100,000 to build, and there are stories that say it cost $60,000. But it was an expensive, fine church, as you probably know if you've seen it. Well, then not only the $20,000, but Henry also donated $2 for every single dollar that the church members donated. So Henry and I contributed a great deal of money to have that beautiful church built. Henry was named a trustee of the church, even though he wasn't a member. But then later on, he did become a member, and he was a Sunday school teacher for 50 years. Every year at the end of the Sunday school year, he would give the children a choice of either a Bible or a silver spoon. Mostly the children chose the silver spoons. And I understand that that little Eddie Essig got 6 spoons for attending. And that little Gertie Kimmel, she got 12. Wow. Well, actually, she got 11. And the 12th year, she said she wanted a Bible. And she went home and told her mother. And her mother said, "What's wrong with you? You go back another year and get a silver spoon." So she has a perfect dozen silver spoons. That's what she told me, at least. Well, anyway, Henry was very, very, very generous, not only with the Lutheran Church, but he was also very generous to Carthage College, which is a Lutheran college. You might know that. It's in Carthage, but then I heard tell that it moved to Kenosha. Well, they did, because of our generosity, we donated over time $500,000 to Carthage College. And those are the dormitories there. That's a 1905 girls' room in the girls' dormitory. It was called the Clara Denhart Dormitory because I did a lot of work for Carthage College. And then there's that new fine brick building. And all of the dining halls for the college were within that nice new brick building. And then somebody said that when they moved to Carthage, there's a Denhart Hall there, but I've never seen it. Well, one of the last things that we did, we dedicated St. Mark's in September of 1912, and I was not well, and I did form the Mothers Club, and I did help with the landscaping, but I became ill and was confined to our home, and then on November 15th, 1915, I died, and the funeral was very well attended because Henry and I were hardworking, respected citizens who had contributed a lot to St. Mark's and to the Lutheran Synod and to Carthage College.
Well, after 42 years of marriage, Clara died. But I was still a healthy and active man at age 75, and I married again, Jenny Holland. Jenny Holland was the great-granddaughter of William Holland. Most of you know William Holland was the original founder of Washington. In April of 1930, the Denhart Bank was closed or foreclosed. The bank was liquidated with Ray Heipel having been appointed as the bank receiver. There's the bank up there. I think I pointed that out before. I was not found guilty of any wrongdoing, although one of the members of the bank was found guilty of having filed false statements to the bank examiners. After a brief illness, I died in 1933, just short of my 91st birthday. It was a well-attended service, as you could well imagine. The long line of cars came from St. Mark's, where the funeral was held, to the location where we're at right here today. I did not have any children, so the pallbearers were nephews. Now, if I may step out of character for a moment, I would like to point out that the engraving here was done within the last year. And that was very interesting since Henry Denhart had no heirs. Well, Dean Essig, the grandson of the sister of Jenny Holland, researched this and found out that it was Judge Heipel and his son Jonathan who were responsible for having this done, the connection being back to Ray Heipel and the receivership. And so we want to thank the Heipels for having corrected this and putting the information there for us. If you have any questions or would like to look at the pictures further, please do so. Thank you.